Hey everybody, I am just wanting to do a little bit of a discussion today around just showing off some of my new vehicles that I purchased, but also on a discussion on scale, comparing some different vehicle sizes for diecast vehicles that you could potentially use in miniature games, but some people could end up here just because they're into diecast vehicles. I have some different scales here, primarily 1/150th scale and 1/43. I also have some 1/32 I'll talk about in a moment. And I have some miniatures here, some 35 millimeter, some 28 millimeter, and some 1/50th scale miniatures that are meant for that scale. So I just wanted to sort of show some of these things. Some of this is in anticipation of the Marvel Crisis Protocol game that's coming out, where I'll be using some themed vintage vehicles and even vintage miniatures in some cases for pedestrians for my Spider-Man board. It's sort of a 1968 Spider-Man cartoon theme board. I really have vehicles that are primarily from the late 60s to the very early 80s, in most cases the 70s, and that's kind of what I'm showing off here. And so just a couple of, for the folks that watch the channel, I've had actually this New York City taxi, which looks like this one is a Chevy Bel Air 1973, and I have that for my Spider-Man board, and I've recently purchased a second. Paint job has actually come out just a little bit darker, but I actually think it'll be fine, for the board. I'll show those a little bit more closer up in a moment. One of the ones that I'm really kind of happy with, one of the two that I'm really happy with that I've recently gotten, is I believe it's a Plymouth Fury. It's a Plymouth Fury, New York City Police Department, 1975. It's got the big police lights, that are on the top. Really characteristic of that time. Really nicely detailed. And yeah, I'm really quite excited about that. It's nice to have a sort of a period police car for the time period that I'm sort of doing for the board. I'll show some of the miniatures up close on these. These vehicles here are 1/43 scale, and so they're all fairly comparable. So I'll just grab one of these taxis when I show the taxis later to show some of the figures next to it. Or I'll start that now. And so essentially, 1/43 is fairly common scale to be able to get vehicles in. This is actually a 1/50th scale miniature. And I'm actually just going to pull back and zoom in a little bit more level. So that's a little bit more squared up. And as you can see, can be considered a little bit short. But I actually think on the table they look fairly good together. I don't think it looks outrageously different. And that's just my opinion. A lot of this really is perception of size. And even at different angles, and when you have things in the foreground and the background, a lot of it is about perception. And I always felt this one looked pretty good, and technically it should be undersized because this is a 1/43 vehicle, 1/50 scale guy. Even based on different miniatures, there can be different heights. These two are fairly similar, both 1/50 scale. And so I would say a little small, but actually works for me. If we go to 128 mil, if I go to 28 millimeter miniature, we're going to have something out of the period here, but I've got a Victoria Miniatures sort of Prussian type miniature here. And to be honest, on the base, it kind of shows you how different miniature scales can be quite a bit different. I actually find the 1/50th scale miniature to be a little taller than the 28 mil. And that's even with a shorter base. I have on a little bit of a shorter base. And yeah, looks a little small. But actually, if I do like a Games Workshop miniature, this is sort of an old Games Workshop Farseer. Now it looks a little bit different. I think with the helmet and everything, it's on the same base. Looks a little bit bigger. And I think actually starts to look towards the size. It looks pretty decent with the vehicle. Now, if I go to something that's like more of like a 35, what's considered to be 33 or 35 millimeter, and that's the Night Models Marvel Universe Miniatures game. And these are all on bases, of course, so that does fudge it a bit. I think it looks a little big, but only because it's on a base. I think if you actually kind of are not looking at it at eye level like that, and where the base raises it, in my opinion, these look pretty good actually, height-wise, and just body more size with the vehicle. So maybe what I'll do is actually just that, and show these same three just at an angle looking down, just to give that impression. So looking at a view that would be a little bit more natural, and not just chin to their looking straight on. There's sort of my 1/50th scale with the 143. There's the Victoria Miniatures 128 millimeter scale, and I think it looks quite good actually there. Here's the Games Workshop Eldar. In some ways he looks kind of big. In some ways, I don't know. He's wide. He's a lot on him, so he's kind of heroic looking, I suppose. And lastly, here's the superhero, miniature from Night Models, the 35 millimeter. I would say 33 to 35. I've heard different folks say they measure, they vary. So I do have actually a size vehicle that I sort of bought by accident just due to its availability. I have a 1965 Shelby Cobra, and it didn't really have on the outside the scale, so I couldn't really determine it. If you look just right here, you can see that it's big, compared to the Taxi. And this ends up being 132 scale. And just for fun, just to show, I don't have any more of this scale. I won't typically get that. If you see the 150, looks kind of small for sure, I think. And then if we go to the 28 millimeter, still looking a bit small. I would say it's even looking big, the vehicle, for the actual 35 millimeter scale. Looks quite big. So I don't think I'll probably be using this vehicle in my games. I'm pretty easygoing on scale, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but I think that's a little bit too out of whack for me. Before we actually look at some buses, which is one of the main things I wanted to show today, I wanted to just quickly show these two taxis a little bit more up close. It's funny, under the light here, the color difference is a little bit less to me through the camera, but I can definitely see it with the naked eye. There's some color difference between the two. There's also a little bit of detail difference. There are definitely two different, I think they're the same chassis for the vehicle, but I think they were actually, I guess, modeled a little bit with some of the decals and some of the added details by two different companies. You can actually see on this one, there's just this top car, this top piece that shows the taxi number and things just looks like this with no added detail on the side. But then this one has just some little lights on the end. Now coincidentally, they're showing you the same cab number. Either that's the same route or the same cab, I'm not sure. But this one actually has some lights on the side. One of the things that I thought was really cool is both of them have New York City style license plates. Coming from New York, I mean those are the license plates we had when I was there. But they actually have two different license plates, which is really cool. And that might be a benefit of actually having two different people do the detailing. You can even see some of the rear tail lights are slightly different in the detailing. But for the most part, it's the same. When you actually look at the sides here, there's a decal showing the rates and things on the sides. and they're showing the same exact rate, the same exact sort of decal there about, like, you know, what you could get for a fare at the time, which is cool. It's probably reflective of the time. And so really excited about to have 2 cabs, you know, for the game, because it's just, if you're doing New York City, it's just so prevalent to have cabs. And then, of course, having the police car is a bit of a must. And so really excited about that as well. I think it's going to really make the streets look really cool in the game. Now, just going to pan and show the buses. So I have 2 buses here. I've always enjoyed my original bus, including that on the board. I think when you're doing city stuff, it's really cool to have buses. It just, you know, makes it seem like you have city transit in there, and it just reminds me of that. I've had this one for a little while now. It's a 1/50th scale New York bus service. And they list it as the Manhattan Express, and I've looked at both of these buses, like images online of the real buses, and these are actual examples of real buses that were in New York City. This one's listed as being the Manhattan Express. It's a fishbowl style bus. I believe this one is a Corgi is the name of it. Yeah, it's a Corgi. They're known for really nice die-cast metal vehicles, and kind of sought after, and so it's not one I want to drop on the table. But basically, I've always been happy with this. I did a stop motion video with this, and I'll show that with some, I'm going to show both of these guys in comparison to each other, as well as comparison to miniatures, and then to some of the cars that are 143, just to give some, to show how these look. And this one here is a new look bus, and this one is listed as the Manhattan and Bronx Surface Transit Operating Authority, and it lists on the front, it says Webster Avenue and White Plains Road, 42nd Street. It's highlighted, so it's you know, meant to really emulate like the real buses in Manhattan, and particularly at that time. And so, given that the game is going to be 40 millimeter, I know there's even larger models coming. I started just kind of eyeing buses because I like them a lot. I've always enjoyed this purchase, just even having as a little collectible. It's kind of a fun thing to have. I'm not a die-cast really vehicle collector, except just to kind of complement this project. And so I took an interest online at some photos, and I'm just going to kind of show it here. Like, this is 143 and this is 150. If you look at them just here, you can get a sense how big they are. One thing I do have experience with is just in doing little diorama shoots on the table and just various things. Really, scale is very much a matter of perspective, and you know, even when you put this in the background, because it's not in the foreground and you have other things of a bigger scale closer, you really, in my mind, can't really tell the difference. So really, when you're in a war game where you're playing a game where you have miniatures and they're all right next to each other, it's going to be more apparent. But really just depends on how you design your board and what you're doing with all this stuff as to how much it's going to matter. Just showing really close head-on, you can see it's really significant here. I think like just doing that turn, for me, looking at it, shows such a huge difference compared to the other positioning that was there. And I think part of that is just when you put on an angle, all of a sudden it just changes your frame of reference a bit. But this one is clearly quite a bit bigger when you look at it. And if you kind of look at them like this, I think again, this will actually show quite a significant difference between the two. So these are lined up, and you can see, oh, they're not lined up. There we go. These are lined up. Again, right there. It doesn't look on screen like they're lined up, but because of the way the angle of the camera is, but this is actually directly lined up here. And I think part of it is because of this fan here. It doesn't look like it. So this one really sticks out in the front, but you can see it's taller and longer and things. You can see, like it should be, you know, from the scale difference. Now, I'm just going to put this large one in the back here for a second. And I'm just going to show here, sort of similar to before. In my dioramas, and playing games and just I've really enjoyed having my civilians in this scale, because these are 150 scale miniatures, and I've done a video. You can see it, and you should be able to see it in my superhero wargaming playlist on this company. The name escapes me a little bit off the top of my head, but it's in my playlist. And 150 scale miniatures look really nice with this, in my opinion. And so it's been great. I actually love these miniatures because I find this miniature line really has it's a very generic look, but it's a bit dated in the way a lot of the outfits are, and they look very much the period to me. And so I've really enjoyed having these. And I still have a lot more of these to paint, and I will one day. And I have these on clear bases. Now, if I actually go more to like 28 mil, in a lot of ways, like we were showing before, this particular 28 millimeter it's shorter than the actual 150, and I think actually works quite a bit with the 150 scale, at least with the door and at this angle. If I actually go to the Eldar miniatures from Games Workshop, now I think this is starting to look like big people, like in front of these doors. Now, granted, we've got the helmets and things, but yeah, it's still usable though. In this case, I think perhaps it works in many respects. And then when I go to the 135 scale, this I actually felt looked a little small, you know, the bus for these miniatures. And so I kind of recognized that. And I always kind of thought that the 143 worked better for the for the 35 millimeter miniatures. So I'm going to repeat this just with the 143 scale bus. And these actually start to look more like children to me now, like in the 150 when using them with the 143 scale. As an adult, that looks very much off to me. And I suppose it should, because I felt they looked really well in the appropriate scales where the miniatures were made, you know, for that same bus size. Now, using the Games Workshop, again, looks really kind of small to me. This is the GW Farseer. Starting to get up there a bit, but still looks a little small, I think. Granted, you know, buses aren't supposed to be small. I mean, they are supposed to be big, and that's one of the things I take into consideration. Then lastly, we have our 35 millimeter Cyclops, and I actually think that actually looks pretty good, to be honest, in my mind. Now, I have a tape measure here. I wish I would have brought my, can't find my little tape measure that actually is a bit better for viewing. But if I actually show here, this character here is actually standing a little bit above, just almost exact actually at 40 mil. You can see the centimeters on the right there, and I think part of that is because of the base. So he's really not 32, and so you can imagine probably a lot of the characters are just going to hover just slightly bigger than that at 40 mil, proper 40 mil, like if they make them that way. The variations in the bases and things like that are going to have them just hover just slightly bigger. It really depends on how they scale them. Because even, let's say, he who is supposed to be 28 mil on the base here is hovering a little bit above 30. It's really like 32. So I think that's kind of what we can expect a bit to see. I don't think this miniature should be too far off. I think it should actually be pretty close to that. And I think actually that's pretty good in my mind. I think that will look good. One of the last things I wanted to show is just that front-on view, which I think looks kind of striking. You look at different vehicle sizes, and if I look at a 150 scale bus with a 143 scale car, you know, at first glance, when I was actually, because they're actually pretty close in width, and that really shouldn't be the case, but just having them on the board, I really didn't find too big of a deal, to be honest. When it was just vehicles, I found sometimes with people it made a difference when you combine extremes. But with just vehicles, I kind of knew the more I looked at it that it definitely made a difference. And if I even just change it to now looking lengthwise, you know, it looks like the car is like almost over half the length of the bus. And so, you know, it really just kind of depends on your perspective a bit. And I do think if you have the bus off in the distance when you're actually looking at your table, you probably wouldn't notice it at all, but you can notice it if you look really close, and it kind of depends on how much it bothers people. But if I change it out, now we're looking at something that these are meant to be appropriate. How close they truly are to real scale, I don't know. But it does look all of a sudden quite a bit more realistic, I think, in its scale, because they're both 143. I'll just switch it out to show the fronts. Now you can see them next to each other, and that bus does look like it's a bit more proper in its size. So yeah, that's really what I just wanted to show today. I just wanted to give an update, just looking at some die-cast vehicles, and hopefully get a little bit more perspective on scale. I'll probably share this to the Marvel Crisis Protocol group, just because there are folks that like to look at pictures like this. They're built in their boards and just get an impression. I know everybody has different sensitivity levels of what they like the look of as far as scale. And many folks for that game are looking at O scale, and I think that is meant to be around 148, 149. I'm not sure. I know O gauge and O scale are two different things, and that was something I kind of learned through the process. But yeah, so hopefully you found this helpful, and talk to you later.